Coming up on Neil in 30 seconds.
Hello. I'd like to welcome you to a very special TV show we're going to broadcast today called Horizons, Perspectives on Psychedelics. It's in coordination with a conference September 24th, 25th, and 26th in New York City at Judson Memorial Church down in Washington Square. My name is Neil Goldsmith. I'm a local psychologist here in New York, and I curated the speakers, and I will be hosting the conference as well. So we have here today with us 3 of the speakers from the conference. There's 14 speakers total, and we've chosen 3 of them to sit with you today and tell you a little bit about psychedelics. They're all professionals. Horizons is a conference oriented on the psychedelic research. It's not about personal experiences so much as it is really about the clinical research that's going on these days at the finest medical schools, and there's lots of research being done in a lot of different ways, and these 3 will represent a little sampling of the breadth of research and the seriousness of purpose with which these folks are approaching the subject. I'd like to read you. I have before me Rick Strassman, Claire Wilkins, and J.P. Harpignaes. You can see them now on screen. I'm going to read their bios to you. Rick is a psychiatrist who's done research in the area, especially with DMT. And Claire is the head of an Ibogaine clinic that treats drug addiction and the use of a psychedelic. And JP is a cultural historian who's talked a lot about the topic and has a very interesting perspective on psychedelics that oftentimes is not that uncritically enthusiastic. So we'll hear from JP as well. So let me read you the bios for the 3, and myself actually too, because I'll be giving a talk at the conference as well. So I'll be involved in this interview that we're going to do today as an interviewee as well. So, excuse me. So first let me read you the bio for Rick Strassman, MD, and then we'll get into an interactive discussion with these folks. Rick Strassman, MD, received his undergraduate training at Pomona College and Stanford University. He obtained his medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City, general psychiatry training at UC Davis in Sacramento, and a clinical psychopharmacology fellowship at UC San Diego. So I need not tell you that this is the real deal, the true professional who has, all the bona fides that you would want. Joining the Department of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque in 1984, he led a research project that established the first known function of the pineal hormone, melatonin, in humans. In 1990, Dr. Strassman began the first new human psychedelic drug research in a generation, studying the effects of DMT, or NN-dimethyltryptamine. After finishing this project in 1995, he left UNM and has worked in various clinical practice settings. He has written DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and co-authored Inner Paths to Outer Space. He is currently president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Foundation and clinical associate professor of psychiatry at UNM. DMT, the Spirit Molecule, is just coming out as a documentary as well, so you can look for that. Rick will be talking about, at the conference this weekend, Old Testament Prophecy, a Western model of the psychedelic experience. Next to Rick is Claire Wilkins. Claire S. Wilkins is director of Pangea Biomedics in Tijuana, Mexico. She is a former IV heroin user and methadone patient who, in 2005, shed her chemical dependencies with Ibogaine, a natural extract of the African root Tabernathy iboga. Ibogaine is classified in the U.S. as a Schedule I drug with, quote, no currently accepted medical use, end quote, even though numerous clinical and preclinical studies have shown that Ibogaine reduces rates of self-administration of opiates, cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol, and nicotine, significantly attenuates opioid withdrawal symptoms, improves depression scores, and greatly reduces craving subsequent to detoxification. So here's a substance that can be used to cure heroin addiction and other addictions that is still considered illegal to do so, and Claire will talk about that. So in 2006, Claire Wilkins created Pangea Biomedics in Tijuana, Mexico, where she has facilitated over 400 Ibogaine treatments and is working with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that's MAPS.org, to study the long-term effects of Ibogaine. As a member of INPUD and INWOOD, acronyms for the International Drug User Rights Organizations, she is devoted to reducing stigma, promoting the health, and defending the rights of people who use drugs. She passionately believes in every human's basic right to medicine. J.P. Harpignaes to the left there I'm sorry, and Claire's topic is 400 Ibogaine sessions, data on detoxification, recidivism, and quality of life. So back to JP. JP Harpignays, associate producer of the annual Bioneers Eco Conference since 1990, and formerly a program director at the New York Open Center, is a consultant, conference producer, copy editor, and writer. He is the author of 3 books, Political Ecosystems, Double Helix Hubris, and most recently, Delusions of Normality. Editor of the collection Visionary Plant Consciousness, and associate editor of Ecological Medicine and Nature's Operating Instructions. JP is going to be talking about psychedelics, utopianism, and psycho-spiritual inflation. So we're going to deflate psychedelic enthusiasm a little bit. As I said, I'm a psychologist. I specialize in psycho-spiritual development. I'm a therapist, author, public speaker with a particular interest in psychedelic psychotherapy. I've curated lots of conferences and cross-disciplinary meetings of the minds for corporations and the psychedelic community as well, including Horizons in this year's MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference. I'm founder of several salons on integral philosophy, media, and healing, and the future of society. I'll skip a little bit of that. I have a non-psychedelic psychotherapy practice here in Manhattan and in Sag Harbor, New York, and you can reach me by my website. I'm going to be talking on psychedelics, psychotherapy, and change. All right, so after a long introduction, I want to really, get to our speakers. So I'm just going to ask really 2 questions. I'm going to ask a little bit about your background and how you came to this field and your passion and your interest in the area, and then I'd like you also to tell us about your talk. So Rick, can you tell us first about how you got into the field, what your interest is, what your focus is in your professional career on psychedelics?
Sure. Well, I started off with an interest in the biological basis of spiritual experience. I went to college in the late 60s, early 70s, and I was really struck by the similarity in descriptions between the effects of psychedelic states and the effects of spiritual experience that didn't have anything, to do with the ingestion of drugs. For example, near-death states and the results of particular kinds of meditation. So it seemed to me there was some common biological denominator that was underpinning both the experiences on drugs and those which occurred without drugs, and that was taking place in the brain. So I began with an interest in the pineal gland because that was an object or a place in the brain or a place in the body where a number of esoteric physiologies had placed emphasis as a possible source for spiritual experience. And so that was in the early 1980s. We began that study with melatonin. At the time, there wasn't that much, that was known about melatonin. And if it turned out that there were, if it turned out that there were psychedelic responses, to melatonin, that would help explain quite a few things. But as it turned out, melatonin really didn't have psychedelic properties. And so then I turned my attention to DMT, which is it's kind of like a chemical cousin of serotonin and of melatonin. It's an endogenous compound, which means it's made in the body, especially in the lungs. And I was thinking that if we gave people DMT and it replicated certain elements of spontaneous spiritual experience, either from near-death or from different types of meditation, then that would support the hypothesis that there is some connection between those states and the natural production of DMT, to the extent that giving DMT would cause those states to manifest. And so this was the first new study with the psychedelics in humans in the U.S. in quite a long time. So just getting all the paperwork in order was sort of a monumental task, and took place between 1988 and 1990. And we began the study in 1990 and wrapped up in 1995.
Excellent. And your current work in the area?
Well, I stopped the research in 95 and have been doing clinical work since then. And I stopped doing clinical work actually a few years back. So mostly I'm working on my next book. I live in a kind of remote part of New Mexico where there's a lot of spinning and weaving and dyeing, so I've been spending time spinning and weaving too. But within the context of the field anyway, it's been kind of a long-term goal to try and put into some context the results of the studies that took place at UNM in the 90s. Is there some kind of model that would explain what we, found, which actually was not consistent with my expectations when I went into the research.
And that, I think, is a little bit about what you'll be talking about at the conference.
Right.
All right, so we'll come around Robin and come back to the conference presentation, so maybe you can pick up that story for us. So Claire,
yes.
Tell us about how you became involved with what is really a medicine, I think, for you, rather than, a psychedelic in the sense that we might think of it normally, in the West at least.
If by medicine you mean not that pleasant to take, perhaps.
So it's not stuff,
well, Ibogaine is a very difficult drug to take. Yes, it's not easy. How I came into contact with Ibogaine was I was a drug user. I was a heroin user, which I discovered heroin when I was 20, and it clicked immediately for me. It was something that really seemed to make me feel normal, which is what a lot of opiate users and drug users in general, when they find the drug of their choice, say. And then I spent the next 15 years of my life struggling with that dependency. I eventually got on methadone, and I was on methadone for over 8 years. And during that time, I knew that most people don't get off methadone. And I saw what all the people looked like who were, in the clinic, and I didn't want that. I used it as a harm reduction tool to get off of heroin. And I researched Ibogaine. My sister actually found it for me. And for 2 years, I saved up my money and I went down to Tijuana, and I took the medicine, and it essentially delivered me from chemical slavery. And shifted my life entirely. I was a bookkeeper for over 10 years and really not doing a great job at it. I don't think it was what I was supposed to be doing. And I ended up immediately, I got a therapist right after, and he said, you must do what you love. You must do what you love. And so I just went right back down to the place where I was treated and started sitting with people. And in less than a year of my treatment, I ended up buying the clinic that I was treated in. And we've been working for 4 years now, treating all sorts of chemically dependent people, and even people who come in who are looking for psycho-spiritual growth and evolution. And it's a really unique tool. It is difficult to do. There's a great deal of introspection that happens. And looking at the hard stuff, the hard stuff. And so we deal with clients that range in, severity of dependency, from people coming in who just want to stop their drinking in the evenings to 40-year career methadone addicts. And I love my work. I love it. It seems to be exactly what I should be doing, and we're constantly progressing and working with clients who teach us what they need, because the whole addiction treatment, the paradigm of addiction treatment is shifting, and it used to be very much 12-step based, and even though that's a good model for a lot of people, with psychedelics, with the reemergence of psychedelics and people being able to use other tools to look at themselves and treat dependency, for example, peyote and LSD also have anti-addictive properties, ayahuasca as well, psilocybin. We're discovering there's a lot of new research that's coming out and being worked on at the moment. And Ibogaine is incredible because it just interrupts addiction immediately, and that's what it did for me. And so we're looking at sort of being in the midst of creating a new paradigm of addiction treatment, and we're working with MAPS on really studying what the benefits are of Ibogaine and what is lacking, what we need, what else we need in order to really create successful, happy, lives for people who are giving up something that really helped them and then became a point where it no longer served them.
So you really, with MAPS and in your own work, really trying to systematize this, what is an African root, am I right?
It's an African root. It's been around for over 10,000 years, or some say up to 50,000 years. We don't know, but it's been used in, Western Africa for many, many years for ceremonial rites and also for medicinal purposes, fertility, immune system, it was discovered accidentally by Howard Lotsoff here in New York City in the 60s, and he was a heroin addict who happened to take the medicine, and it interrupted interrupted his heroin addiction. And he went on to study Ibogaine for 40 years and work on developing clinical trials and creating treatments. And he's essentially my spiritual father.
Well, how you mentioned the other hallucinogens and the research that's going on, including with addiction problems, with helping with addiction to other drugs, using LSD, for example, to help with heroin addiction. But you also talked about Ibogaine as interrupting.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Ibogaine, in its interrupting feature, how that differs from the other psychedelics.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can just tell you from my own experience as an opiate user with opiate dependency. There's really no placebo that you can use when you're comparing for treatment. There's nothing that will really interrupt the addiction. With Ibogaine, what seems to happen is it goes in and actually works on your receptor sites and repairs them. There's brain repair going on, and this is a really novel thing in detox. Most of the time you go through detox and you're feeling worse. You can't sleep, you're more depressed, you're more anxious, your cells are craving their medicine. Ibogaine comes in and sort of shapeshifts and acts like your medicine, so you don't feel that yearning and craving for what you usually want, and goes in and repairs your opiate receptors. These are things that all need to be studied. There's many theories, but it's definitely clear that brain repair goes on. There's and in comparison to the other drugs, you can't take peyote and you can't take LSD and just interrupt an opiate dependency. It's just impossible. I don't know why it doesn't work that way, but it seems to be that Ibogaine goes and works on the neural cells and creates neuronal growth. There's a repair that seems to be happening.
Yeah, I think the research is showing that the other psychedelics tend to work to generalize in a life review experience version, like if you're in an automobile accident, you see your life flash before your eyes and you change your life. And so those work in that way. But the Ibogaine, apparently what research there is that's coming out more recently, and there's some pretty good laboratory type research happening, is showing that there is some real neurochemical.
Yes, you stop administering. You actually physically, without even any conscious attempt, you stop administering the drug that you're normally administering. Yes, it decreases completely. I mean, over 90%, we've detoxed completely, 93% of the clients that came into us. And, they say that 1/3 to 1/2 of clients in traditional detoxes aren't even detoxed by the time they leave detox. So this is something that's a big karate chop to the addiction. It comes in, it's like, hi-ya! And people talk about getting your choice back. And that's what Ibogaine does. It interrupts it so you have that space and that breath to go, is this something I really want to do? Do I want to go back to use? And for most people, actually, they do go back to it. And there's a whole slew of reasons for that, and I'll go into that in my talk.
Perfect. So that's the perfect segue, because we'll come around, Robin, again, and you'll tell us a bit about your 400 instances that you've documented. So thank you, Claire. JP. So, and by the way, I've been having all the fun here sort of interacting with you guys, but please feel free, the interviewees, the panelists.
We can talk to each other?
Yeah, please, to liven it up a little bit, to ask any kind of questions.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that Humphrey Osmond had good results treating alcoholism with LSD way back in the 60s in Canada. But not enough research has been done on any of this stuff to have really definitive,
Well, that's what's so exciting about these times, is that there seems to be a huge resurgence and interest in it.
And Horizons is going to feature a lot of that research, too. So, JP, tell us about how you came to the area and your interest and your passion.
Yeah, well, I've got to say right off the bat that psychedelics are a small part of my overall work. I mostly work in the environmental field, and I also write about culture, and I've written about genetic engineering and other socio-psychological issues, and so psychedelics are really just a small part of the work I do. But I was raised like Rick in the 60s as an adolescent, and so obviously was profoundly marked by the counterculture, and psychedelics were extremely important, for better or worse. I had some good, fantastic experiences and some very bad ones too. I was a little too young when I started, I think 15, and my brain wasn't fully formed. So I think that the idea of deconstructing your personality before you have a personality fully formed is not a great idea as well. But that's a more complex question. But anyway, it did mark me profoundly in a cultural sense. And one of the things that interests me the most in light of the fact that environmental work has been so important for me is the relationship between eco-consciousness and psychedelics. Is a very interesting untold story, because obviously a lot of environmentalists who go, the ones who testify before Congress or have to be legitimate, don't want to talk too much about, if they had a psychedelic experience that helped enhance their environmental consciousness. That's not something they're going to tout in a big way. But I think that's a very interesting story. And I think Dale Pendell, who's going to speak at the conference, is going to touch upon that as well, in his own poetic way, I suspect, rather than a sociological one. So my main... really, the main aspect that I've dealt with in terms of psychedelics is that as part of organizing environmental conferences over the years, one of the main conferences I work on is called the Bioneers Conference, and every year we have as one of our sessions something on ethnobotany, and often that's about psychoactive plants, because we deal a lot with indigenous issues and have a lot of indigenous leaders. So obviously the issue of the historic and traditional use of traditional plants such as peyote or ayahuasca or with the Mazatec mushrooms and so on has come up, and people who've worked in the botanical field. So a lot of the leading ethnobotanists, and I got to know people like Terence McKenna, and in fact I was the first person to bring Terence McKenna to the East Coast in the early 90s. So I got to know a lot of these folks through putting on these panels, and then I edited a book called Visionary Plant Consciousness, which collected a lot of the best of these panels over a 20-year
Highly
period.
recommended, if I might.
Right.
I love that book.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Really beautiful.
So yeah, that's been my main, professional, quote unquote, to the extent it is, or maybe slightly less amateurish, involvement in psychedelics, but nowhere near as in depth as these folks or some of the other people at the conference. So for me, it's been a sideline of interest, but something that was very important in my life personally, so that, I think has gotten short shrift. I think that the contribution of psychedelics to cultural phenomena and socio-political phenomena has really gotten short shrift. Now, that said, I also think there's a shadow side to everything, and so what I'm going to focus on at the conference, and we'll get to this when we do the next round of questioning, is going to be more on the shadow and the dark side, because I think any movement, just like any individual, when you become mature, you also have to start looking at your failings and your shadow, and so that's what interests me. I might get booed off the stage, and I hope to survive the weekend, but that's my main ambition. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I have a feeling you're going to make a good contribution, too. Just trying to say how your model might actually be the more healthy model for a culture, where psychedelics are a significant and important part of one's life or one's career even, but aren't the primary focus. And there'll always be a realm for researchers and folks who make it their primary focus. But in terms of the general populace, when psychedelics are more well reintegrated into society, then of course there'll be less need to make it such a primary focus, where we're really sort of beating the drum, because it won't be necessary.
Well, I don't know about that, because I don't think psychedelics are not a primary focus of the mainstream culture. Remember, this is a subculture or a few subcultures, so we're very marginal in light of the mainstream. I mean, the only way psychedelics are talked about largely by the mainstream is either as a law enforcement problem or as buffoonery, in the Cheech and Chong and stoner movie mode. Those are really the only two modes that you really, and then now a little bit the New York Times has been occasionally covering some of the research and the new work that's being done, which is a positive thing. But by and large, it's considered marginal or buffoonery. So in that respect, I think it's, a lot of the work that's being done is very important, but I don't think it will ever be an important feature of life. And that's a difference that I had with people like Tim Leary or Terence, and I used to get in private arguments with Terence about this. I think that these are interesting substances precisely because they're extremely powerful, but that makes them dangerous too. Any tool that's powerful has its dangerous side, and I don't think it's something for the masses of people. I mean, this was a big argument between Huxley and Leary in the early 60s, that Leary wanted to turn on the world, and Huxley was saying, no, we should keep this for a small group of artists. I mean, in a way, I'm grateful to Leary, because people like me probably never would have heard about it if Huxley had had his way. But nonetheless, there's something to be said. I think, these are not to be taken lightly. I think, they can be very worthwhile to visit these deep archetypal psychic states, but this is not without perils, you know. So I had the misfortune or to have to go to a lot of mental hospitals in the late 60s because my mother was frequently confined to them for a whole bunch of reasons. And I was, you know, a hippie with hair down to my ass and, you know, really enthusiastic about the counterculture. And I was shocked to see whole wards full of acid casualties. So that kind of was, you know, when I was 18 and 17, 18, 19. So that sort of...
Does that imply that there's something dangerous about acid, or perhaps something dangerous about us as a society that doesn't know how to deal with people going through that process?
Of course, it's a dance. You know, it's like nature, nurture, and you know,
it's a screening process too. You don't want somebody that's about to get schizophrenic to be taking a powerful psychedelic drug either. I mean, that's stress that will throw them into an overt illness.
In my ideal society, we would have these beautiful campuses where people would, you know, fill out questionnaires, and the ones who really were ready and qualified would have wonderful setting, and, you know, it could be, an area of study for those people who are into it. But now it's kind of done as sort of self-initiation by junior high school students and, you know, going to the mall, you know, you know, so there's and I did all that too, so, you know, it's...
other than schizophrenia, the primary contraindication for the use of psychedelics is immaturity.
Yeah.
I used to joke sometimes when I spoke that nobody under 40 should take a psychedelic, and I don't believe that literally, but it was a conversation starter. You know, I don't know. I mean, I look to the tribal use, the ones that grew naturally without, you know, Western dualistic modernity, industrialism, without that whole cultural impact, the cultural practices that grew in tribalism, where they use them maybe for rites of passage. And each tribe does it a little differently, I know, but they are integrated into the society. And so I'd like to think about, and I'm going to segue into what I'm going to, you know, my focus on with psychedelics a bit, you know, is that society can change or reintegrate, like I said earlier, psychedelics, because they've been really a part of every culture, pretty much every culture throughout history in some way or fashion or another. And, you know, except Western society and a few others, they've been incorporated. There's been a way to incorporate psychedelics, visionary plants, into a ritual process with some guidelines. Ritual becomes, you know, a set of curbs or guidelines for practice, for safety and efficacy, which is the FDA requirements for drugs. So, you know, I'm a psychologist, like I say. I'm interested in the concept of change, and psychedelics are the most powerful psychiatric medicine or you know, spiritual sacrament, or both, really, depending on your perspective. And so I became interested in, I took psychedelics when I was in college, and then at about the age of 40, I was working for a corporation as a strategic planner for emerging technology. And I was reintroduced to psychedelics in the form of MDMA. And so I'm a little knocked by that 30-second notice, but that brought me to an interest in the area. We're 30 seconds till we're done, Paula?
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. Well, let me then draw us to a conclusion. We're not going to talk too much about the presentations, I guess, but I will encourage you, if you see this before the conference, or to look us up online and to familiarize yourself with these guests and some of the other work we're doing. The Horizons talks will all be online, so please take a look for Horizons, Perspectives on Psychedelics. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Neil.
Keep rolling.
You can keep rolling because we'll put this on YouTube if there's extra,
All right.
so you can keep the conversation.
Great. So apparently
okay,
we've had a little break where part of it won't be shown, but now we're in extended play, I guess, and we can continue with our discussion. No, that's great. Thank you very much, Paula.
So how long does that go for?
How much longer do we have, Paula?
10 more minutes.
Okay, great. So we'll speed it up then. But basically, you know, so I became interested as an adult in the area, found it profoundly helpful personally. And when I left corporate America and reopened my clinical practice, I was influenced so dramatically by my own personal experience that my clinical practice, which I had as a younger professional before I went into corporate, had completely changed 180 degrees. And now I was, more myself really, and more, I like to think soulful or more involved with my clients. And my view of the way personality forms and the way personality changes became radically revised, radically different from my own personal experiences of viewing my own insides. And so, that's influenced my practice. And then I'll talk a little bit about my talk if we get time to it. So let me, in the interest of time, move on. And Rick, tell us about what your presentation is going to be like at the conference.
Well, I'm going to be presenting a new kind of model for the spiritual aspect of the psychedelic experience, and it's going to be oriented around the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament's concept of prophecy. And I'll be speaking about the concept of this particular state called prophecy, not necessarily as predicting the future, but as the Old Testament's version of spiritual experience. And sometimes there could be a component in that takes, which partakes of predicting the future, but that isn't a necessary element of the phenomenon. The reason I became interested in the Bible's concept of the prophetic state is because the models that I had entered into when I was performing my DMT studies weren't actually fulfilled or didn't quite comport with the reports of the volunteers. I had a very long time affiliation with the Zen community. I'm a Zen Buddhist community. And actually it's interesting, as JP was talking about how quite a few of the people that are in the environmental movement got their start with psychedelics and are uncomfortable speaking about it. It's the same thing that takes place within the Buddhist community. Yeah. Almost the vast.
I think it takes place everywhere. I think if we came out more about our drug use, our illicit drug use, as opportunities for awakening, it would really enable it to be more legitimized because there's so many people.
Right. And his books like what the Dormouse said, I think, is
about the cyber,
the influence of psychedelics on the advent of personal computing, for example, and also Zigzag Zen,
right,
which talks about the point you were making about the religious community.
Yeah, and all of these Westerners that became Buddhists or entered a path of Buddhist meditation as a result of their first LSD experience. Yeah. After they become upper ups in the organization, they're very uncomfortable speaking in an open sort of manner, regarding the importance of those experiences in their current position. Well, I was expecting with respect to the DMT effect that it would be a more typical Buddhist enlightenment experience, the white light, the ego dissolving, the unitive experience of, no form, no concepts, no ideas, no images. But instead it was very interactive. The ego was intact and, could relate to what was going on in the world of light that the disembodied consciousness of the volunteers entered. It was a lot more give and take, and that wasn't really compatible with the Zen Enlightenment model of what I was expecting. So I've looked around for different models, and the one that I'm comfortable with now is the Hebrew concept of some kind of prophetic state, which was experienced by anybody in the Bible who communicated with angels or with God. And it's a strongly Western model. It's based on the Bible, which is one of the most powerful texts in the world. I think it takes into account a lot more the phenomena of the DMT experience than either the Buddhist model does, or even in some ways the shamanic model.
Well, I'm going to look forward to hearing your talk.
Me too.
I'm going to move on. Claire, tell us about what you're going to be talking about, your research.
I'm going to be talking about Ibogaine and how it's used as a detoxification tool, and how successful it is as a detoxification tool, immensely successful. And I'm also going to be talking about recidivism and relapse, which is a word, relapse, I'm not very fond of. I find that as drug users, we can basically look forward to a life of using drugs. And rather than trying to just interrupt everything, and this concept of being clean can be really burdensome and overwhelming for a lot of people who are just trying to get rid of the most harmful substance out of their lives. And then what is the rest, looking at their pharmacopoeia, what other medicines are their allies? It's practically impossible for people to stop using drugs completely, and this notion of abstinence is very outdated and not realistic. I'm much more in support of a harm reduction model, where we get honest and meet the clients where they are in life and assess where they are. And actually, I have no agenda. The agenda isn't let's get you clean. It's what would you like to pull out? Do you want to get rid of these antidepressants? Do you want to get rid of the Adderall? And then getting an agreement and then supporting that. And we're also going to be looking at what constitutes a successful life for a heavy drug user, and what people are doing and what we need more of in the treatment of addiction.
Can't wait to hear you. JP.
So my talk will be more about the sociocultural aspects of psychedelic subcultures, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we discussed about short shrift, the influence it's had on cyber things, on environmental, on spiritual seeking as a mass phenomenon that was very influenced by psychedelics in the 60s and 70s. But I'm also going to focus on the shadow side, on the darker side, and I think that self-analysis and self-examination, just like as it's important for an individual, is also important for movements and subcultures. And so that's a little bit what I'll talk about how there are tendencies towards apocalyptic and utopian ideas, and those sound contradictory, but usually utopian and apocalyptic ideas come in a dyad. Usually you get we've sinned, so we need to be cleansed by, terrible apocalypse, and then there'll be the pure utopian state afterwards. Yeah. Almost every human ideology has aspects of that, whether it's religious or Marxism or, or 2012, whatever. It's a sort of a universal template. So I want to get a little bit into that and talk about how we have to have a little bit of more of a deeper, honest look. And the reason that I think it's important is that these are very unstable and frightening ideological times in terms of the incoherence and irrationality politically that we're seeing at the moment. And we have to have a sort of self-examination about, are we going to contribute to that irrationality and that incoherence, or are we going to find some lucidity and some groundedness within an experience with substances that don't lend themselves to lucidity and groundedness. And so that's, there's some complex issues there, and I will touch upon that. So in a nutshell, that's sort of...
Yay, JP, can't wait.
It's not the drugs.
So to wrap it up, I'll just tell briefly what I'm going to talk about, and then I think we'll draw the show to a conclusion. I'm talking about psychedelics, psychotherapy, and change. And, as a psychologist doing therapy, one would hope that psychotherapy leads to change, but there's some research that shows that a third of the people get better and a third of the people get worse and a third of the people stay the same. I think that's probably an outmoded generalization, but certainly there's some question as to the efficacy of psychotherapy, in part because of the topic really of change. Is change really an appropriate goal for psychotherapy, or is loving acceptance, not compromise, not closing off to difficulties, but coming to understand and accept with a mature eye things from childhood or what have you. So, and the question can also be asked, of course, about psychedelics, because psychedelics are supposed to do all sorts of things: cure addiction, give you enlightenment. Maybe it's been some people want to think of it as enlightenment in a pill, which it certainly is not. But there's been lots of claims for psychedelics. Bring your marriage back together. Cure, childhood autism, remove your fear of death to the dying, and many of those are true applications, and so something happens. But there's a difference between just growth versus development, maturation, transformative change, which is sort of what's promised by psychedelics. So I explore that, and I explore the connection between psychedelics as a way of illuminating one's insides. I like to think of psychology as psycheology, the psyche, the study of the soul, because that's where psychology really began. And so I believe that psychedelics, in some visionary way that has a chemical substrate, of course, but experienced in a visionary way, show you, illuminate your core, your essence, who you really were before you developed your personality in interaction with your parents. So that vision, which helped me shape my clinical practice, I think is what helps my clients not change exactly, but come to get beneath their personality and to be able to continue the unfolding of their natural development from their core essence. And so that's what psychology is about for me, and that's basically what I'll talk about in my talk. So maybe we have a minute or two left. I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions for one another or comments on what they're doing.
I have a question for you about how, with your experience with psychedelics informing your own growth and the growth of your practice, how do you encourage that in your clients in a society where most of the psychedelics that have transformative value are scheduled?
I'm glad you asked that question because I want to repeat again, I don't do psychedelic psychotherapy.
Yeah.
It's informed my practice.
Right.
If you go to my website, you will see the word psychedelic mentioned twice in the bibliography. And that's it. My clinical philosophy doesn't mention the word psychedelics. And for the reasons you suggest, I really don't want people who are looking for psychotherapy and a more traditional kind of an approach to be turned off by the idea of psychedelics having informed my philosophy. But if you're a psychedelics enthusiast and you read my website, you'll say, oh, that's that. You'll see in what I write, you'll recognize it as being perhaps psychedelically inspired. Mm-hmm. And so I like to think of what I do as sort of like a contact high in a way, where I don't need to discuss psychedelics with my clients to imbue upon with them that, to educate them really to that perspective and to help them adopt it and unfold in a beautiful, relaxed, loving way. Now, because I'm public and I do public speaking and whatnot, a goodly chunk of my practice comes to me because they know I'm interested in psychedelics. Mm-hmm. And anyway, so...
we just ran out.
Thank you so much.
In other words, it's over.
Yeah,
Oh, gosh. Oh, thank you. So anyway, come to the conference because that's what we're going to be talking to you
Yeah,
about.
lots of good conversations.
Oh, thank you very, very, very. Oh, man. Oh, I forgot what I did.
How long are you in town for?
Till Monday afternoon. Yeah.
Your work. Because the whole idea of chemistry, and consciousness hasn't really been integrated.
No, it's not been integrated. And what's the best spiritual system in the West?
It's the Bible. But the fact before that, do chemicals create consciousness, or does consciousness create the chemicals? Is the question I want.
Yeah. Well, the chemicals are the substrate. And that's where it's taking place.
Right. It's the hardware.